So, the role of the US presidency has evolved significantly since the days of Lincoln and George Washington. What are the most critical changes in presidential power, especially regarding military action and global influence? And how has this affected the balance of democracy?
It's a great question because we use the same word president as if it's a timeless office in the way we say mother and father. But in fact, the office is radically different from what it was like even 50 years ago. First, as your question implies so well, Ayush, presidents now have global power in a way that was inconceivable even 50 years ago. Now, the president of the United States can use precision weapons to literally destroy someone's house or even destroy you in the driver's seat of your car without necessarily injuring the person next to you if everything goes well. So that degree of killing power and precision, it's scary. And it's an enormous amount of power. Obama was the first president really to have that, and we don't have a legal structure even to manage that. And other countries, of course, are developing that power. So there's the global reach of the president. There's the lethality of the office. There's also the reach of the president as a communicator. For all of the social media and all of the new communications technologies, they've given voice to influencers and Gen Z and others, but they have certainly magnified the voice of a president because now the president's voice can be heard instantaneously. And that voice can be used to create facts where there aren't facts, to spread good information, but also to spread disinformation and to spread lies. And we saw this during COVID. And so that reach in that sense is a big deal. And then the next thing that has to be said is that presidents have taken on the ability to act first and then ask questions later, using military force, using economic power, using money that's been appropriated by Congress, often in the billions of dollars, moving that money from one place to another, enforcing certain measures, not enforcing others. Congress ultimately decides what money is spent, and Congress ultimately makes the laws, and the Supreme Court interprets them. But the president has first mover advantage. And presidents have taken advantage of this. More executive orders are issued by presidents with every administration. And so they're less checked. And it's hard for Congress and the Supreme Court to check them after the fact. It's hard to reverse actions that have already been taken.
We were highlighting how social media right now plays a very different game in terms of communication. You were saying that, not to put words in your mouth, but there's kind of like an instantaneous factor of
Yes.
instead of, going through all the hoops to put out a press release, the president can just tweet, for example. But does that change the relationship between, the citizens and the president? Does it make like does the accessibility to the president, does the kind of curtain coming down, the ability to tweet at 2:57 a.m., tweet at 4 p.m. randomly about anything and everything. Does that change the relationship with the president? And if so, to what degree? Is it kind of like, oh, now the president becomes a friend or the president becomes more of a foe?
Well, I think it allows the president to intrude in your life in a way that the founding fathers never expected. They created this office as an office that was to have limited powers for someone who was distant from most people. And the truth is, for the first half of American history, most people didn't pay attention to what presidents did most times. Of course, they paid attention during war, but on a general basis, they knew about as much about President Grover Cleveland as our listeners do now, which is almost nothing,
Yeah.
right? Most people didn't even know Grover Cleveland was a president, right? The idea was that this was supposed to be someone who had limited responsibilities at limited times. What social media has allowed, it's sort of put the radio and television on steroids. It brings the president to us. And so now it's not just that the presidents are sending you stuff by email or on their website, but you're getting, yeah, social media posts, you get texts. I mean, any American now is receiving, hundreds of texts a day from Vice President Harris and presidential candidate Trump asking for money, asking for your vote, right? They're getting in the way. They're intruding on my privacy. And this is what creates a lot of stress for people. It's also what gins people up, right? We tend to blame social media influencers, but it's often the politicians who are ginning us up by
Mm.
sending us videos or telling us stories, true or not true, it doesn't matter, that are designed to get us to be more emotional. And so I think that is a definite change that's occurred, and it's meant that we also expect the president to be there for us. There's no limit on what we expect the president to do. So we have this Superman image, and people run for office saying, "Look, I'm going to make sure everyone has a house." Or I'm going to end the war in Ukraine by once I'm elected president. These are actually quite silly things to say, but they're believable in an environment where the president is ubiquitous and therefore seems part of everything that happens everywhere.
Does the asymmetry of power that the president has with its citizens play a role in how those citizens see democracy and also change their relationship to democracy? Because it feels like there's a kind of fluidity and understanding of what America is right now, of what democracy is, of what America should be, of what democracy should be. And I feel like that only happened very recently. Like those kinds of, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very astute question. Absolutely. Most people, when they think of American democracy, they think of what we're going through right now, which is an election cycle for a president. And of course, we're electing members of Congress and local officials, but they focus on the president. We're presidentially obsessed. And
Yep.
that's, again, exactly not what the founders wanted. And it isn't even the way it was 30, 40 years ago. There was a time when most Americans felt that the politician who mattered most to them was their congressperson or their mayor or their city council representative. And in fact, that's still true. Most of what affects you on a day to day basis in the US, in Canada, anywhere, is what a local official decides. Do they put money into the school in your neighborhood? Are they fixing your road or fixing someone else's road? Do they, in Montreal, get the snow and the ice off the ground or not? Right? I mean, that's what matters for your life. But we've lost sight of that. My students, they know who's president and they have an opinion on the presidential race. They might know who their senator is. They don't know who their congressperson is. They know none of the names of their local representatives. The president has stolen all of our attention. And that, first of all, creates, again, this image of a more powerful figure. That's a challenge to democracy, and it undermines our knowledge and attention to where democracy really works, which is at the local level. This is what Alexis de Tocqueville said when he visited the United States in the early 19th century, that what made America work was that people were committed to democracy in their towns, in their villages. Right now, I fear we're committed to it as a nation, but not in our local communities.
Right, and it also goes back to, do we understand what democracy means in the
Yeah.
micro level in order to enact it at the macro level, at the macro
Yeah.
scale? Um, one of the bigger things right now is, as the president wields more power, it's not just about economic or military power, but it's also, as we're talking about, social power. They're becoming these major celebrities. I think Obama was one of the first major celebrity presidents, but then Donald Trump, former President Trump, presidential candidate Trump, took it to another level. Again, I want to paint the picture of where we stand right now in order to juxtapose what the founding fathers had envisioned. But where did this kind of celebrity, keeping up with the Kardashians fiasco, like situation of the presidency come from? Was it gradual, or was it kind of like a road to Damascus experience of, on one day we're not paying attention to the president, the next day we can't stop paying attention?
It's a great question. Some of it has come with power. People are always drawn to power. It's Henry Kissinger who says that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac, right?
Yeah.
People are drawn to others who are powerful. And I remember when I was writing my book on Henry Kissinger, having lunch with him a number of times in New York City at these busy restaurants. And I mean, he's a short, ugly, fat man and not old man. And nonetheless, I mean, the world stopped when he came into the restaurant. Everyone's eyes were on him. Again, not because he was pretty, not because he was tall and and sort of a physical specimen, but because he was powerful, and people want to say they were there. And all these people are coming and taking photos. They know nothing about what he did, but they know he's a powerful guy, right? So, as the power has accreted to the president, as you've talked about this, that has made the president a celebrity. That's a sign of being powerful. But then there's the secondary thing, which is money. And this has always been an issue in American politics. Money has always had power, but now there's so much money put in by people like Elon Musk and others into gaining access. And what that does is it creates these events that are media manufactured events And that's what the money is going to, right? The money and the power draw our eyes to what is happening. And it's night and day from what the founders expected. You know, George Washington didn't even get a salary. He, as president, basically, you know, spent his time trying to mediate between his cabinet officials and going around the country. He's a very modest man. He spent more time with his horses than anything else. And the office was supposed to be modest. They didn't want it to be a celebrity. Do you know that you weren't really supposed to campaign for president? The first person to really actively campaign was Theodore Roosevelt. It's not that other presidents didn't have campaigns, but you were supposed to have a surrogate do that, right? You were supposed to sit on your front porch and have people come to you. But those going out on the hustings, those going out giving speeches, as our candidates today do 4 or 5 a day, uh, other people were supposed to do that, not you. You weren't supposed to be the celebrity doing that.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And this is the time where I'd like to take a major step back to, kind of like the start of America. What were the founding fathers envisioning? And I just want to riff on this a little bit because a lot of people, myself included, they don't really understand what made America. They think America right now, and let's say the West in general, they think it's the vanilla of the world. And it's not. It took a lot of trial and error, a lot of courage, a lot of bravery, a lot of sacrifice to get to where we are now. And we're just taking it for granted.
Right.
And so when we're talking about the history of America, that's interesting. But what were the also philosophies that kind of built America that the founding fathers had in order to shape the nation?
Well, they were radicals and they were young men. You know, your Gen Z listeners, my students, your listeners, the people who are going to remake our world and save us from climate change and all these things. I have such high hopes for this.
Likewise.
Um, you know, that's who they were too. They were young men who wanted to change the world. They had come of age, most of them as British citizens. They were unhappy with a failing empire. They believed they had an opportunity to change things, but they didn't know how they were going to do it. What they had were two things that I think Gen Z has today that Gen Z's parents didn't have. They have the courage of their convictions, and they have a desire to learn. They want to get it right, and they know they're not going to get it right immediately. This is what I see with my students, what I see in the startup community in Austin. These incredibly hardworking 24-year-old former students of mine who have raised capital, but they're still eating ramen even though they've raised millions of dollars because they're working so hard and using that money to get their companies to solve a problem, to create clean energy or whatever it is. That's the way to think about the founders. They were trying to do that in politics. They wanted to invent something that didn't exist, which was a democracy that was more than a small city, but actually a large country, and one that was filled with diverse people that could become prosperous and have consent of the governed. And they believed the way to do that was to create a system where no one had too much power. Their real insight was that power corrupts. No one should have too much power. They believed in people amassing some wealth, but not too much wealth. And they believed in people amassing power, but not too much power. So they created a system of checks and balances. They created a system that encouraged individuals to go into office and try to make a difference, but they also put checks on what they could do as a jurist, as a member of Congress, as a president, as a military leader. And that idea of checks and balances, separation of powers, was really one of their great insights. And the other insight was that people should serve in office for a short time and then return to their lives. They didn't like professional politicians, or what at that time were called courtiers, people who spent all their time at the monarch's court. So they wanted a rotation of a citizen soldier and citizen politician. So those are the things they wanted, and that's where we started. Of course, we're in a very different place today, but separation of powers and citizen politicians and soldiers is what they wanted.
Dr. Suri, I know this is kind of a silly question, but it has to be asked. How did we, and maybe when did we, stray away from these philosophies and these ideals? 1776, Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence when he was 33, while
Right, right.
while creating the swivel chair. I learned that
Yes.
from Vivek Ramaswamy on Lex's podcast. But all of these people, these great people, these great minds had a vision for the
Yeah.
future of
Yeah.
America. And slowly but surely, it felt like some force, not an omniscient or like purposeful force, but just some maybe social force, some social pressure started chipping away at those ideals, at those philosophies, started making it easier for those things to not be upheld. When did this happen? Was it again a gradual thing? Can we talk about certain events that maybe shifted things so slightly or so majorly? Go ahead.
Sure, sure. So I think it was a gradual process, but it wasn't an even process. There were certain moments that had a big effect. So for the creation of more powerful presidents and more powerful individual figures, the Civil War is a key moment, and my most recent book is on this because it's I think so relevant for today. For good reason, Abraham Lincoln has to take on so much more power as president. He's the first president to take on the power through the Conscription Act to actually force people into the army. At the start of the Civil War, he had to ask states to provide volunteers. He asked governors. Could you imagine that today if the president had to go to governors and say, please give me soldiers?
Yeah.
By 1862, 1863, he now had the statutory authority to conscript people to fight. He creates a temporary income tax as well. So many of these things that we take for granted today that were unheard of before became part of the of presidential power. It didn't make Lincoln a tyrant. In fact, Lincoln was using all of these powers to win the Civil War, to keep the Union together. He had a very self-limiting vision of this power, but he created that capability. Just as drones created a capability for Obama, not necessarily a capability he wanted as president, but an ability to use that power. So there are moments like the Civil War that out of necessity call upon leaders to do new things. And what we learn from history is those emergency moments, they don't just go away when the emergency's over. The powers that are taken on, they remain. With regard to professional politicians, this is a really interesting story. I think early on, most American politicians think of themselves as a farmer or a cobbler or a business owner first, and then a politician second. But the complexity of government, the amount of time and effort it takes, makes it more of a professionalized responsibility. And then there's just no getting around the fact that as our country becomes bigger and more prosperous, there's more profit in being in government. And that's an unfortunate thing. But it's not surprising that most members of the U.S. Senate are millionaires. And many of them have only been in the U.S. Senate. So you wonder how, on a Senate salary of $180,000, $200,000 a year, how is it that you've become a millionaire? And this is as true for Democrats as it is for Republicans. And it's because when you have access to power in a really, really rich society, that gives you access to a lot of money.
Sure. And it is but it is one of the unfortunate things about money and power seems like the one thing that can be corrupted in many different ways. Like you can cut that cake so many different ways, but
Yes,
it kind of always ends in corruption. Lex Friedman always likes to say absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think he
that's
said
right.
that probably in your
He did.
conversation.
He did, and that's Lord Acton who originally said it. But Lex says it very well too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But can we take a step back to the first president, George
Yeah,
Washington?
yeah,
He gave up power.
yes.
Was it twice or just once?
Twice he gave up power. So he was the commander of revolutionary forces when the Revolutionary Army was able to convince the British. They didn't defeat the British Army, by the way. They just convinced the British that fighting was too costly here. The British had much more interest in India. They would prefer to use their forces in India, where my father comes from, where I think your family comes from as well. And so, I mean, as my grandparents in India used to always say, they saved America, right? And so the British forces diverted to back to England, and they were eventually used in India and elsewhere. And so the Revolutionary Army, commanded by George Washington, was able to claim victory and control the 13 colonies to the enormous surprise of King George and others. George Washington, after he won the war, said, you know what, I'm going back to my farm. I'm resigning my commission. They expected that he would make himself the new king. That is how European history worked. You became king two ways, right? One was you inherited it, your father died, and you were the next in line, or Caesar's way, you won a big battle, you took over an area, you conquered, and you declared yourself king, kind of Napoleon's way of doing it. And Washington didn't do that. Washington didn't do that. And that was enormously surprising. It gave him credibility when the new government was being formed after the interregnum of an Articles of Confederation that did not work well. When the new Constitution was being formulated, he sat in. He wasn't a major contributor intellectually, but he kind of sat in as the figure everyone trusted. We've all been in those kinds of meetings where not necessarily the smartest person in the room, but the person you feel you can trust with what you're doing next, the caretaker. And then after 2 terms as president, where he remained very popular, he said, "This is enough," and gave a really wonderful farewell address in 1796. It was actually published in major newspapers. I encourage people to read it, where he talks about just what your question asked so well, why it's important to give up power. And here's the thing: Washington understood, first of all, that if you stay in power too long, you undermine what it is you're trying to accomplish. And second, he understood that a functioning system cannot be about one person or even a few people. It has to be about a process. And that's what he was creating. He was an incredibly wise and self-restrained, disciplined man.
And self-aware, it seems.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely. Well said. Well said.
and the way, I don't know if you're doing this purposefully or not, but the way that you're speaking about him, it's like an incredible contrary understanding to the way we're living through the history that
Yeah.
we're living through right now. And one of the last questions I want to ask before I turn to the next topic is there any way to pull back power? Like
Yes.
is Okay, please.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think the most obvious way, and this is why I'm so glad you asked about George Washington, is we have to all recognize that in ourselves. We have to be willing to step back. It
Right.
used to be that a gentleman was trained to be someone who was self-aware and self-restrained. You didn't say everything you felt because you could get away with saying it. You
Mm,
didn't use your superior strength or money. There was a kind of we've all met people like that. Now there were problems with that world. I don't want to idealize it. It was also a world that didn't include people who look like you and me, right? So it was a stratified world. It was a white man's gentleman's world. It didn't include women, et cetera. So I don't want to go back to that. But there's things we can take from that. That's what we do as historians. We don't go back to the past. We learn from the past. And there's too much craving of power now. There's too much reverence for someone who has billions and billions of dollars. I revere someone who's invented something. Look, I drive a Tesla. I revere what Elon Musk did in pushing forward electric cars, at least in the United States. When I bought my Tesla in 2017, there weren't many other good options for electric cars. He was doing that, right? Um, but just because you've done that doesn't mean you have to take over X and
right.
try to make yourself this, I don't know, larger than life figure in politics and all this stuff. There should be a certain modesty. You should see your own limits. So that's one way. And then I think we can be more enforcing of what is the core wisdom we talked about already of a separation of powers. There should be limits on how people can use their money to influence politicians. There should be limits on how long politicians can stay in office. I'm for term limits. Presidents have a 2 term limit following the mid 20th century. I'd like to see term limits in other areas. I think they work. I think they work very well, and I also think that we as voters should not choose the same old men all the time. And I'm not just referring to presidents here. I'm referring to members of Congress. I think we need younger blood. I think we need to encourage younger blood in, and then those people who are young who get in, then they should also, after a few years, move on and do something else.
Like there has to be a kind of arc, there has to be a way to not churn people out, not in a factory sense, but to get fresh people, new ideas. Because at the end of the day, these are all just experiments,
Right.
and we don't want to suffer, which I think we're doing right now. We don't want to suffer from the stale, stagnant position and keep on dealing with the problems. And it's kind of like if you never change your credit card habits, the debt only keeps piling up kind of
Right,
thing.
right, right. I totally agree. But too much of what we do now, we do even though we're unsatisfied with it because we can't agree on what to do next. The Electoral College is a great example of this. No one likes the Electoral College. Most people don't understand it. It's not a college. it's, and the only reason we don't get rid of it is because we can't agree on what to do next. Some people are afraid if we just go to a full popular vote, that it'll mean California, Texas, New York dominate things too much. Some people don't like the current system, but they don't know what else they could do next. I mean, so we're just stuck with like hitting our heads against the wall or taking on more credit card debt because we don't know what to do as an alternative. We need to experiment. We need young people to say, let's try something different. And if it doesn't work, then we'll try something else.
So, okay, I'm going to ask you a very kind of multifaceted question. So I apologize if the buildup is quite substantial. Let's say America was from 1776 to now. Let's say it was kind of like the transition from a horse to a car, where we were all looking at it and being like, Henry Ford, I think, was saying if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, stuff like that. It was like this obvious kind of realization of, oh yeah, cars are so much better than horses. I can do many more things. That's all good. But now it seems like America has become more of like the yellow cab industry, where there's a lot of corruption, a lot of this, a lot of that. It's very difficult. It's very kind of confusing. Where and when and who should be the Uber to this? Like, how do we get young people in these areas? And I know we just said we want young people, but I also want to pull back and say, well, do we want young people or do we want mature young people? Do we want young people who have an understanding of history
Yeah.
in the way that you're describing? So how do we build that Uber style America?
Well, I think that's what we're doing right now, right?
Okay.
We reach out to young people who are talented and eager and willing to put in the work. And in this case, to listen to a conversation, not just to you and me, but to listen to versions of this, right? I love podcasts. I do my own. I come on wonderful podcasts like yours because I think the audience for podcasts are young people who they're probably working out now while they listen to us or they're in their car or whatever, but they want to learn, right? They're curious and they recognize that there is more to learn so that they can do better. That's what we need. It doesn't matter what your IQ is. It doesn't matter what your background is. It's the desire to learn and do differently. The most dangerous people are people who think they have all the answers.
Right.
It's those who want to learn new things, who are willing to try new things. If we can bring that spirit and that energy into government, we can make so many positive changes. And the way to start is not to run for president. The way to start is to get involved in your local community. As I said before, we pay so little attention to this, but there's so many opportunities at a local level to do things, to experiment. You don't like the way in your community that they're managing parks. They're messing that up and pools and whatever else it is. Okay, get involved, run for the local office that oversees that. Convince other young people, they're probably enough to elect you. Get yourself in there and then try something new. And you know what? Once you start doing good things, it's the same as it is in business. It's like honey, it attracts people. And then you can move up in the process by doing that. But it's all about the ideas. Too many people think, well, the way to do this is to become a great speaker and to attract a lot of followers. That's helpful too. But I'll remind you, that's not where Obama started. That's not where young leaders who have made their way started. Obama started in the Illinois legislature, which is one of the worst jobs in the world. Very low paid in Springfield, Illinois. His family was in Chicago. He had to take these, short little small planes to Springfield all the time, but doing stuff on the ground, doing stuff for the state. And before that, he was a community organizer. He's not the perfect example, but my point is that's how you have to get involved. And I've seen that work. I've seen that work. Our member of Congress, one of our members of Congress from Austin, Greg Casar, he and I don't agree on everything, but he's done some really important good work. I support him for that reason. I don't have to agree with what you're doing. I can support you for who you are. He started as a community activist in Austin. Then he was on the Austin City Council. Then he got elected to Congress. And this is why he's there. He's trying new things. And that's what I want to see. People who are curious, hardworking, and willing to, as Theodore Roosevelt said, willing to go into the arena.
Speaking of the arena, were there any presidents who were students of history like yourself? And how did those presidents and the way that they enacted policies, the way that they treated people? I mean, just as an aside, Obama was a very professional person. The way he talked, the way he dressed, is just there was some embodiment of swagger that he had. And it feels like on the maybe cognitive or intellectual side, there is that same strength when it comes to being a student of history, to understand the French Revolution, to read Alex de Tocqueville, to understand the transition from the Roman Republic to the Empire, things like this.
Absolutely.
Are there any names that come to your mind, and what did they do?
Well, so many presidents have been very well educated historically, and many others have educated themselves. It's interesting. Almost all presidents, with the exception of Trump, once in office, became very heavy readers of history because they recognized that no one could identify with what they were going through except the people who had come before them, right? Their community is like, again, I'm part of these wonderful groups in Austin where you have tech entrepreneurs, 25, 26-year olds, super smart people. That's why I go, so I can learn from them, right? They have a community. That's why they're in Austin. That's why they're in Boston. That's why they're in San Francisco, right? They have a community. Well, presidents don't have that community, right? I mean, if you're lucky, there are two or three older ones around, but they're usually too old to help you anyway, right? So they can't hang out with other presidents, right? And so they look to history for wisdom. They look to history, I think, also to make themselves feel comfortable to say, yeah, even the greatest presidents had opponents, had people who didn't like them, right? Even Washington had opponents. So the office encourages that for those who are thoughtful. Many come in with that, in part because they're well educated, in part because that's been the secret to their success. So the most obvious two examples of this are the two Roosevelt presidents, Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, who were both very well informed historically, and history helped them to understand how America's role in the world was important and changing. Traditionally, even in the mid 20th century, when Franklin Roosevelt was elected, most Americans didn't want to pay attention to foreign policy. They were isolationist. Our default is isolationism because we're such a big country. We grow our own food. Yes, we need the Taiwanese microchips and stuff, but in general, we're more self-sufficient than almost any country in the world. And so there's a tendency to look inward. We don't learn foreign languages, all these things, right? Um, and these two presidents, the two Roosevelts, understood from their reading of history that when you're a big country in a complex world, if you're isolationist, you're going to face major threats and you're not going to be prepared for them. And both of them, Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, had the wisdom to understand that the country had to be prepared to defend itself, but also had to recognize the limits of its power also. And this notion of being a participant in the world, an internationalist, I think that came from their historical reading. And that's one of many examples where I think you can see that.
This is a very dumb question, but would listening to podcasts also be a substitute? It seems like for Gen Z and maybe for millennials that eventually become president or even want to run, these instead of being confined to the physicality of a book, using technology. I guess a better question would be, what kind of technology can future presidents or people who want to run utilize to become better suited, better read, better educated?
Yeah. I'm a deep believer that there are many technologies that can help us to learn history. I think books are essential, but they're not the only source. There are certain things you only get from a book. It's a meditative experience. It's an experience of immersion. I mean, what happens when you're reading a book is it's not just the words, and this is true for fiction or nonfiction. It's that you get drawn into a different world. Now, a movie does that as well. And also a podcast can do that. A radio show can do that, but it draws you in a different way, in a slightly more passive way. So I think books are essential, but they are not the only or even the most important way to think about history. What really matters is, are you hearing the stories of other times? Are you learning about how other people thought about things? Just the question you asked to start. What was different then from today? Why do we study history? Not because the past is some silver bullet that's going to explain things for us, but that we have to get out of our own world and see our own world from the perspective of another world. When we do that, when we see our own world from the perspective of the 18th century, the 19th century, we ask new questions. Things look different. If you don't have a historical perspective, if you only know your own story, the story of your time, you can't imagine things being different. I grew up in a working class part of New York City, and there were people I knew, and when I'm back in the old neighborhood who are still there, who have never left a few blocks in New York City. That's the only world they know. They think they're the center of the universe because it's New York, right? In fact, they're the most provincial, close-minded people because they can't imagine the world being different. What history allows you to do is see your own world through other worlds And so, what is essential? It's not the book, it's not the words, it's not the archive, it's the stories, fact based stories that help you to understand what is it the founders wanted, why are we different today, and what do we learn from that experience?
Beautifully said. And it does seem like that is a very personal experience. Like, a president, I mean, I'm not saying that they shouldn't do this, but a president couldn't hire you, for example, and just get you to explain all of these things, 1 hour a day. I think you'd be incredible and it would be an amazing thing. But also, I think that you would also want them to pursue it on their own.
Precisely, and not just listen to one person. I mean, you don't only go to history from one source. That's the beauty of it, and you form your own interpretation based on facts, but your own interpretation because you're hearing many different perspectives on those facts. I mean, you and I both have families that are have a connection to India and British colonialism. The only way to understand British colonialism is not only to hear the stories from the British perspective, you've got to hear them from the Indian
Right.
perspective too. And then you form your own judgment, and you and I might have slightly different historical judgments, both fact based. But that personal intellectual formation then informs what we do as we think about foreign policy and domestic policy and other things.
Professor, I want to double click on that because that's very interesting. It brings up an interesting meta question. Don't get your history or don't learn history from one source. Right now, Gen Z and Gen Alpha are becoming kind of like the generative AI generation, where they're asking ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, and they're typing in a question and they're getting an answer that's incredibly biased, that, for what it's worth, since I understand the technology, maybe may have taken different kinds of things from different places, but it's still a kind of generated response that is given to you rather than assimilated in your head through your own understanding, your own agency.
Right.
How should you begin to understand history? Is it just by reading, if let's say you're a liberal democratic history, how should you start sprinkling in conservative history? How should you start sprinkling in other opinions, like how other countries view America, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's Britain, whether it's France?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, I guess I'm answering my own question
Well,
in a
it's
way.
but you're asking the right question as always. Ayush, it's a terrific question, and I think AI can be very helpful. I mean, I have colleagues who say, oh no, this is the end of the world." No, every technology poses new challenges and creates new opportunities. Most technologies are misused at first. I think we're still in that mode in social media. I think in 20 years, you and I will be doing a follow up podcast. Hopefully, we'll do many follow ups before then, but we'll be
Absolutely.
doing one. Yours will be the most popular podcast in the world. We'll be doing a follow up, Ayush, and it'll be about how social media brought us together and we agree too much now, something like that, right?
Right.
Because the uses will change over time. But you hit the nail on the head in that what makes history important is the thinking we do as we put different facts and different experiences together. You cannot outsource that to the AI, but the AI can be enormously useful in giving you the pieces for that story. So let me give it just a concrete example, right? Let's say you are interested in really getting an unbiased or as unbiased as possible understanding of slavery. It's crucial to the American economy in the 19th century, crucial to race relations in the U.S. Everything in the U.S. in some way is connected to slavery. All that money in New York in the late 19th century was from the management of the finances of slavery, right? So, how would you do this? AI could help you by giving you access. Here's what I would say to you. I've done this kind of project with students. Okay, Perplexity or ChatGPT, give me some relatively short narrative accounts written by slaves so I can understand what their life was like. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, right? And Frederick Douglass wrote 3 memoirs. You don't have to read all of them, but maybe AI will pull up a 20-page segment for you that's really interesting, where he talks about being a young boy as a slave who was prevented from learning how to read, how he had to sneak around to learn to read, things of that sort. Okay, so now I have some understanding, a little bit, of what it was like to be a slave. Now, AI, please give me some memoirs of those who were slave holders, slave
Hmm.
masters. Let me read about it from their perspective, right? And I want AI, I want you to give me some accounts not by people after the fact who regretted it, but accounts that were
Uh,
written at the time by people defending slavery. And let me hear their perspective. And then we can ask for other things. I want the overseers. I want Abraham Lincoln. Right. And then as I'm reading this, I'm getting a fuller picture of the world. It's like I'm seeing the photo album more. And now I have a better understanding of what slavery was about. And then maybe that helps me to understand our society today and the effects today. Maybe also helps me to understand why some people don't want to talk about this and why some people don't agree with me on race issues, right?
No, that's incredible. I never thought to use the technology in that way. That's a very refined, but also, and this is not a slight, but very broad way of
Yeah.
using the technology.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Um, yeah, no, I'm definitely going to start utilizing that in a more concrete way. If we can turn to realpolitik,
Yeah.
what precisely is that? Obviously I listened to you on Lex and I did my own research, but for Gen Z who have grown up rather in, with ideals of social justice, with ideals of, morals and ethics, what is realpolitik and how does that kind of contrast with those things?
Sure. So realpolitik is not an excuse to do whatever you want to do. That's a misuse of the term. Doing whatever you want to do is just being a bad person. Okay.
Yeah.
So, going out and saying, I'm strong, and because my country's stronger than yours, we can do what we want. The Vladimir Putin approach to the world, that is not realpolitik. Realpolitik is the recognition that the world is terribly imperfect and that therefore, when we are pursuing our ideals, we often have to choose among lesser evils rather than the most preferred outcome. So, for example, I think the United States, I agree with Samantha Power, the United States should be against genocide in any place that it occurs. And we should not support genocide. But there could be genocidal behavior happening in multiple places, and we might not have the resources to actually stop it everywhere. So we have to make choices. And we might make choices to act in the places that we have the most interest in or where we think we can be more successful or where we think there are people at home who will support that because they're from those communities. So that's why we cared more about genocide in Yugoslavia in the early 90s than we did in Rwanda. It's terrible. But that was realpolitik, choosing lesser evils. And it takes a certain maturity and self confidence to do that, and also to protect oneself against falling into cynicism, which again says, oh, well, I'm only going to do the things that are good because they serve me. No, I'm going to try to do the best I can, but I recognize I can't do everything, and I'm going to have to make choices. That's sort of where we are in the Middle East. I'm torn myself, and I'm sure your listeners are torn. I'm sure everyone who's smart is torn on these issues. I don't have an answer, but I do believe that there's no perfect solution. There's no way to say, tomorrow I'm going to wake up and I'm going to solve all the problems for the suffering Palestinians in Gaza and for Israelis who have been attacked so many times and were attacked on October 7th and horror was. So I've got to find things to do that hopefully help both communities, but they're going to be lesser evils.
It does seem like, not in the way that you're describing it, but it does seem like realpolitik is kind of like a papering over of the issue. Like, yeah, it's hard, like the hardest choices require the strongest wills type of thing. Um, you wrote a book on Henry Kissinger and his interactions with realpolitik. Could you say more about that book, what you found
Sure,
about that, and
sure.
how he dealt with realpolitik?
So, sure, and he passed away about a year ago, and I was doing all these shows, for radio and TV, and everyone wanted me to say, was he a good guy? Was he a good guy or a bad guy? And my answer was both, right? I mean,
Right.
what I respect so much about him as a child of the Holocaust, that's where the book begins, right? He's 13 when the Nazis come to power. And his father had been a very Orthodox Jew. Their social life and community life was all around synagogue in Fürth, in this community outside of Nuremberg, Germany. But his father worked for the gymnasium, which was a well-respected school, and he taught non-Jewish Germans. So he was assimilated in a sense. And for his father to lose his job and for them to be forced to flee as refugees, he never got over that, as refugees never do. And it taught him something, right? It taught him that being right was not enough, that you had to have power. And sometimes you had to sacrifice a little righteousness to have some power to protect yourself, right? I think every refugee kind of goes goes through that, right? Being right doesn't put food on the table. Being right doesn't keep your kids alive, right? Kissinger lost more than a dozen family members to the Holocaust, right? So that is what I respect about him, and he approached foreign policy not trying to erase trade-offs, but to sometimes make the best trade-offs possible, knowing he had to make those trade-offs. Where I become critical of him in the book is where I think he came to see that only he could make those decisions, and so he didn't listen to others, and therefore his prejudices started to sneak into his choices. His prejudices against people who were not European. His prejudices, he particularly didn't like Indians because he thought Indians were not European, but yet many of them, elite Indians, thought they were as smart or smarter because they had gone to Oxford. And he felt he didn't like that as well. All kinds of prejudices that would sneak in. And that's the danger, again, of power corrupting. He became corrupted, as I think Americans did in the Cold War, by being so powerful and being able to do so many things in a thoughtless way. And for example, the war in Vietnam, the coup in Chile, things Kissinger was a part of, were mistakes he made because of that. So there's a warning about realpolitik. This is where you're going, right? It can become a papering over or an apology for just doing bad stuff. You say, I'm doing these bad things because there's something bigger. And everyone who does bad things always says that, right? This is the Leninist argument. I have to break some eggs to make an omelet. No, that's not acceptable. But the opposite is not acceptable either, looking for the perfect solution, which can debilitate you so you don't act, or it can lead you to overcommit to one thing and not see the trade-offs. So this is what makes things so hard, and that's what that book is about, is finding that right balance. It takes a very wise person. And back to our point about limited power, no one should be doing it too long, because once you're good at it, you overstate your power. Like as soon as you get good at it, you should be fired because now you're going to do too much of it.
Absolutely. First of all, if anybody ever says, for the listeners, if anybody ever says, sometimes you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, always look at them, squint your eyes, and ask them, so when have we ever made the omelet?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, it's such a strange thing
Totally.
to say.
Totally.
And I feel like people just repeat that without really understanding it. And another thing, which I did, which I want to correct, is I repeated absolute power corrupts absolutely without understanding it. So as an aside, I want to ask you, what is power corruption or corruption of power? What does that look like? That does seem like a very gradual thing, but how can you notice yourself maybe kind of corrupting to power? Like in a very imagistic example, when an apple starts corrupting, you can see the mold, it becomes ugly and all of these things. It starts a bad batch of apples kind of metaphor. What is that with power in a human?
I love that metaphor. I'm going to go with that. It's usually not that you are corrupt. I mean, people say, I'm not corrupt, right? I'm not taking bribes. Most people don't take bribes. I'm not, lying to people. Most people don't explicitly lie. Right? So what's corruption? I think there are three signs I've seen as a historian, right? In good people, everyone is corruptible. You and I are. In fact, we could, in the wrong circumstances, become very corrupt. No one is inoculated against corruption in a circumstance that encourages that. Too much power will corrupt anyone. So here are the three things, among others, to look for. This is the beginning of the mold on your apple. The first is I start telling myself that only I understand how hard it is to do what I'm doing. That means no one should criticize me, right? I've had so many conversations with university administrators who have made, I think, bad decisions. I could be wrong, but I'm saying to them, I think you made the wrong decision. And instead of debating it with me and showing me why I'm not understanding the trade-offs, they'll say, well, you don't understand what it's like to be me. That's like the parent saying, I'm the parent, right? That's a sign that what you've said is somehow I'm anointed in this role and the power gives me a unique perspective. That's wrong. That's the beginnings of corruption, right? That's when you don't listen to anyone. So that's number one, right? I call that the narcissism of power, right? Only I understand, right? The second is where you find yourself doing things that are worse and worse without good outcomes, without the omelet to show. Without being able to say, I didn't get this value from it, right? Or where you have to make it up, right? That means you're using the power to promote yourself, not to actually accomplish something. The teleology, the goal should be obvious, right? So that's the second. You're divorced from the goals. If the first is the narcissism of power, right? That's sort of the unfortunately the love, the aphrodisiac of power. Look what I can do. Look at how I can do. Look how I can send my troops around the world and show how strong I am. Yay, USA! Right? That's that version of that. And then the third and probably the most notorious and the one we can all really fall into is when you cannot imagine giving up power. You become so attached to it. It defines you, right? The power should be used for what you care about. If actually the power becomes your identity, then you're in real trouble. Then you really are. That's when your apple has become, an orange or something else, right? And this is a real problem with a lot of politicians in all kinds of societies. They've been in office so long they can't imagine not being politicians. So what does that mean? That means you'll do anything to stay in office, and that is immediately when someone who has money can bribe you without calling it a bribe. You want to stay in office. You're the greatest ever, Ayush. I've never seen anyone who's so good at this. So, in order to stay in office, you need this money I'm giving you to defeat your adversary. And so you take the money.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple things about that. Number one is that in terms of the narcissism, nobody understands this better than me. It seems like Gen Z is going in that direction in a generational sense with respect to the way that they treat other generations. In my book, I put like this self-righteousness and this vanity that Gen Z have of, oh, other generations don't understand what we're going through, so we're going to have to figure it out ourselves. Which is, there is some truth to that, obviously, but that does kind of play into the narcissism of like, what do you mean they don't understand? Have you tried? Like, it's what I keep asking any Gen Z that says that or retorts that, similar to the breaking the eggs, where's the omelet?
Right.
Where is your effort type
Yeah.
kind of thing?
Yeah.
One of the other things is the just war in terms of realpolitik. What lessons can Gen Z learn about the balance between necessary military action and restraint? And will there ever be a just war?
Yes. And I think there have been just wars. I think fighting to defeat Nazi Germany was a just war. I think the efforts of the Rwandan Patriotic Front of Tutsis who responded to the Hutus who were massacring them. That was a just war. That organization then did things that were unjust itself, but there was a just war in defending a whole group of people, a particular element of that society, a whole group of people defending themselves against being massacred. So there are just wars, and St. Augustine, through Michael Walzer, we have a long literature that helps us to understand. One thing is proportionality. One of the problems with wars in the Middle East today is that they're not proportional. You have hospitals being bombed to try to get one bad guy who's allegedly in the hospital, and you're killing thousands of innocent people. That's not just. That can never be part of a just war. And those are things the United States has done too. I don't want to just criticize others. You can argue dropping the atomic bomb was unjust for that reason. So you can have a just war and unjust elements, making it an unjust war at certain moments also. Um, what I think is the most important lesson, if I had to really give one as a historian, is that just wars, or the phrase you use that a lot of scholars use, you've obviously been reading about this, necessary war, that the bar has to be really high. When you have a lot of power, you define a lot of things as necessary, kind of like the spoiled kid who needs
Yes.
everything. And no, it's not a necessary war just because you say it's necessary. It has to be really necessary, essential to the survival and the continued sustenance of your society. So, yes, you can justify almost any war if you're the United States in that this war will make us wealthier somehow. We have this ally who supplies us with this or provides this market for us. No, that doesn't make it a necessary war. But if it's a war where, as in the case of Germany, you're facing an adversary, Nazi Germany, that's going to take over Europe and potentially threaten you and eliminate genocidally whole groups of population, yes, you can find necessity in that. But the bar should be higher than it normally is in our vernacular.
And see, this is the thing, is that we've only understood just wars in the sense of a unipolar world. It's never been multipolar like this, and
Right.
we've never been fighting wars on multi fronts. And what I mean by that is we're also fighting in the digital sphere, we're
Yeah.
fighting in the social sphere, we're infighting as well as outfighting. And so, as the nature of global power changes, how should we start thinking about not just warfare, but politics in general? Does it, obviously it changes, but in what ways does it change? And I know it's a difficult question, because we're not just looking at history right now, because this is rather an unprecedented thing. But are there lessons or little stories or traits to derive from history that can help shed light on how to best move forward?
Yeah, I think there are some historical lessons. That's where my expertise is. I think there are other parts of this where you and other people in Gen Z and other will have to figure it out because it is unprecedented. Every moment is unprecedented. It has what's new and what's old.
Mm,
And we can master what's old, and then we can experiment with what's new. So,
mm,
what's old? What have we learned in history? A couple of things. First, the United States has always been most successful when we have worked as part of a larger group of allies. Fighting alone has never, ever worked out well for us. Because no matter how strong you are, if you fight alone enough, you create a set of other enemies who band together against you, right? There's a balancing effect, international relations theorists would say. We overstate the bandwagoning effect of people following us because no one likes a big, strong bully, and we underestimate how much people who wouldn't like each other now like each other in responding to us. So we need to counteract that by being good friends, by compromising, by building alliances. From the American Revolution through World War II, it's our alliances that make us better. And today, our advantage in the world is as many mistakes as we've made in general. People like the United States better than they like Russia or China, if you had to choose. And so that's an advantage in building alliances. India has proven this, right? India has made a shift toward being a better U.S. ally. It used to be much closer to Russia and the Soviet Union. But if you're Narendra Modi, who I have mixed feelings about as a leader, by the way, but if you're Narendra Modi, you look at the United States and you say, yes, they have problems. They're hypocrites. They're always condescending to us as Indians, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what? They're a better partner economically, politically, in all these ways than Putin or Xi Jinping. And so we need to build on that. So create partnerships. I think this applies across all areas of work. We're better as partner builders than as unilateral actors. And then, second, I think we have to be willing to act in a restrained, thoughtful way that involves using the full range of our capabilities, not just relying on the military and sanctions, because those are the two things we can do most easily. Quite often, our policy is driven by the tools that are most usable rather than the tools that are most appropriate. We don't use enough diplomacy. We don't build relationships as we should. We don't try to find the compromises. We don't find alternatives. And so I think really using the full range of our resources, not just the heavy hammer and the big fat dollar all the time, can actually help us.
I'm gonna ask one question and then I'll ask another question afterwards. What books and pieces of media do you recommend to any person that wants to understand American history or America in general? And please, go into detail on your books as well, why you wrote them as a historian, and what differences, nuances you bring to the table as a historian writing a book.
Great question. So I've written and edited 11 books, written 5 books just myself. The book The Impossible Presidency, that really relates to where we started the conversation, really looks at not all presidents, but looks at some of our most important presidents, because I think we have a lot to learn from them, right? And we have one big advantage with presidents when we study them. We know so much about them. I'd love to write a book about the leaders of big businesses, but they usually won't share their records with me, nor should they, right? They probably have proprietary stuff in their records, right?
Yeah.
But the president of the United States, it's a public office. And of course, presidents, don't write everything down, but there's a lot of material we have. And we can learn a lot by looking at these powerful leaders and the problems they confronted, even when they were working hard and very talented, as most of them did. They were mostly hardworking and mostly very talented. So, one kind of reading, I think, one kind of source is to find analogs for our present moment and find people in analog positions. So, if we're thinking about leadership, presidents, right? If you're someone in the technology space, I think looking and studying the role of different people who were technological pioneers, like a Henry Ford and others, I think that's super helpful also. So I encourage that kind of reading. Then the most recent book I wrote, Civil War by Other Means, is on the legacies of the Civil War and how it still affects our politics today, for good and for bad. And I think that kind of reading is important too. Events, moments, back to your question about when did things change. If you want to understand change, you have to know where the change came from. And so I think going back to particular moments and reading about those, as I try to do in that book, to try to show what happened after the Civil War and how it really reset the debates and assumptions in our society that are front and center, for instance, in this presidential election right now. It's an ongoing debate. We can be better prepared for that debate by reading that kind of work. And then I think it's also important to find figures whose life experiences somehow overlap with your own, to help put your own life in perspective. And of course, my life is very different from Henry Kissinger's. But one of the reasons I wrote that book on Henry Kissinger is because, I'm the child of immigrants myself. And to me, it was always extraordinary that someone who came to the United States in 1938, not speaking English, at age 15 at that point, could rise to the kind of power he rose to as a scholar, as an official, as a celebrity figure. How did that happen, right? And it's so interesting. But then also he did that, and yet he was very flawed and made a lot of big mistakes too. And I think there was so much in that resonated with me as the child of immigrants. And so, and I think anyone who has an immigrant experience, a figure like that, becomes really important. So I think books can be helpful. I think you can listen to them. I've done podcasts about these books. I do a weekly podcast on history and democracy called This is Democracy. Not as good as your podcast, Ayush, but worth listening to. My son is on as well. We try to make it interactive. I do a Substack
Beautiful.
newsletter called Democracy of Hope, where I try to show how the history of democracy can give us hope today, how we can see opportunities for experimentation. So I try to do, all those things. And I think we all need to find the outlets where we can get access to this kind of information and where we can express ourselves also. So some of the things that I don't write that I read, I really like reading, honestly, the New York Times. I think the New York Times provides a really interesting perspective, thoughtful. I know a lot of the reporters there, many were my students. I think it's a good daily source to go to. They have an excellent podcast, also The Daily, which I recommend. I like The Economist. I like reading German newspapers and French newspapers. I sometimes read Hindi newspapers, not too much. So I think reading broadly. And then one other thing, I love reading fiction, and I encourage everyone to read fiction because it also helps you imagine a different world.
Yeah, beautifully said. And one thing about the podcast, first of all, I disagree with you, even though you're being polite. I feel like with podcasts, especially, and this is one of the things that, podcasts are incredibly similar to books as they provide an incredible level of detail and depth, but they are very different in the way that, for me, it goes back to 50,000 to 300,000 years ago when we were sitting by the fire and listening to our elders speak. And there's a kind of, not tribalistic, but there is some kind of resonance to hearing people talk about interesting things. I'm not talking about like the podcast that interview celebrities and talking about their sex life. I'm talking about actual like important topics. Again, not
I
to be
agree.
narcissistic about these
I
things.
agree. No, I find myself quite often. It's interesting. I subscribe to like 50 podcasts, but also people will always send me, especially my students. They'll say, "Oh, you need to listen to this, Professor Suri," and oftentimes I'll be okay. I'm going to listen to like 5-10 minutes of this. I start, and it's like an hour and a half later,
Yeah.
and my wife's like, "Where were you? You're late for dinner." I'm like, "I was listening to the pod." Like, I can't tell you the number of times I've driven like to dinner. I'm sitting in the parking lot. I'm like, okay, I've got 5 minutes. I'm early. I'm going to listen, and then like 45 minutes later, I forget that I'm still sitting in the car because I'm
What,
enjoying the podcast.
what do podcasts do that books don't for you?
They do two things. One of them you already said. They humanize the story because you're hearing the voices,
Yeah.
and so it's human. It can be a little superficial, or you can feel especially if it's a subject you're not familiar with and it's hard to get into it. You can feel like you're skating on the surface when you're reading the book. It's like also a bad a movie that doesn't resonate with you. You're like sitting there, and you're like, I don't quite fit into this. But a really good podcast, the voice draws you in, the passion of the person, the conversation. We as human beings love conversation. As you said, we're sitting around the fire. And so there's something about that that draws me in, especially when it's someone who's passionate and really cares. And then the second thing that just builds on what you said about that is there's the serendipity of it. I don't know where it's going to go. Like I have a
Hmm.
sense of what the themes are. The problem with a book, we all do this, is you can look ahead to the last chapter, right? And you have
Yeah.
a sense of what's happening. And if you've read reviews, or if you read the jacket of the book, it tells you, right? The beauty of a really good podcast is, right, you understand the themes, so you have a sense of the direction, but you don't know where it's going to make landfall. You don't know how it, and that, I mean, there's a kind of suspense and engagement with that I love. I have to listen. I can't stop now, honey. I've got to get to the end because I don't know what's going to happen.
You bring up such an interesting understanding for me, which is kind of the difference between a tape recorder and a record player, where a tape recorder you have to kind of like listen through and then rewind all the way back, where a record player you can pick up the needle and go
Yeah, yeah,
anywhere.
yeah,
So your temporal relationship to information changes.
totally.
Um, Very interesting. Well, I have a couple other questions, and they're
Sure.
all over the place, but you're just a very fun person to talk to.
Oh, thank
So
you. Thank you for saying that.
you were talking about how sometimes you have to read about certain people who maybe overlap with your life, but you were also writing about Henry Kissinger. What did you learn about yourself while you were writing that book?
So if we were talking about reading, but the truth is everyone should write. Thank you for opening a space for me to say this, right? Go on my rant about writing, my kids would say, right? You can't think well if you can't write well. And speaking is not the same. Speaking helps, but what writing forces you to do, I think there are substitutes for books, as we've talked about. There's no substitute for sitting down, or you can be at your word processor, be pen and paper, or at your word processor, whatever it is, and actually forcing yourself to think through and formulate your argument and your story. And when you do that, you learn so much about yourself. First of all, things that are clear in your mind, you realize are not as clear when you start to write about them. I thought I understood that, but I can't explain it, right? If you can't explain it in a few sentences, you don't understand it, right? That's why I always tell people, you can't teach it. People will say, well, I understood it. I just had trouble teaching. It's like, no, you didn't understand it if you couldn't teach it. So it helps you to articulate. But to your specific question, when you've done a lot of work on something, it's a business plan after years and years of formulating your business, or it's a book after years and years of research, right? You start writing and you realize now it's become part of you, and how you think about it is very, very different. And so when I was writing about Henry Kissinger, I mean, one of the things that really came out for me that I didn't intend to do, the book was going to be much more about his foreign policy. It became a book also about the challenges of being a Jewish outsider in American society. And my father's Hindu, my mother's Jewish, so I'm kind of a little bit of that. And how much American society has been changed I mean, the book's about Jewish Americans, but I think the same is true about Indian Americans. How much these two communities have transformed the United States, I think for really good things and good ways. But the challenges and what it's meant for us. And I felt more like an immigrant writing about this. When Kissinger deals with people saying negative things about him because of his background, I felt that, as I know everyone in Gen Z does. And you can be white and feel that. People can be incredibly prejudiced towards, white people from a rural area. And so I'm not saying I don't believe in whining either, but the point is that helps us to understand. And I saw a lot of myself in that. Also, Kissinger is the most ambitious person I've ever been around. I've been around some very ambitious people. I'm very ambitious myself, and it taught me the perils of being too ambitious, actually. And I
Mm.
think I learned a lot too. It was a kind of like therapy session for me writing that book, thinking, okay, you know what, too much ambition is not good. I grew up in an environment you had to always be number one. You had to always, and I had to learn writing that book, and then being a parent of young children at the same time. I kind of had to learn how to walk that back a little bit. If I hadn't been writing about it, I wouldn't have come to those conclusions. It was not the research, it was the writing and telling the story and seeing myself in it that changed me.
Yeah, beautifully said. It's very important writing, not just I mean, you and I find it very fun. It's just, when you enjoy it, it's one of the greatest things in the world. Being able to get one idea and then see how far that idea can go. It's a great comfort being able to do that. But it also changes your relationship to ideas
Yeah,
because
that's right.
I know that I won't believe something in my mind until I can actually write it out. I think Robert Breedlove on the Lex Friedman podcast said, if you can read it, if you can write it, and then you can vocalize it, you have this crystallization of the idea.
I think that's
I,
spot on.
I really believe that. Can I ask you a couple of the darker questions about
Yeah,
America's
sure.
future?
Sure.
So I haven't fully read it yet, but I got the abridged version of The Fall and Decline of the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
And I always have this not running joke with my dad, but I always have this kind of like very dark, saying or retort of like, I really feel like an Edward Gibbon is writing a similar thing about the American Republic right now. So many questions around this, but first of all, do you think that the transition similar to the Roman Republic to the empire is happening in America right now? Do you see inklings of that? That's number one. Number two is that do you think America, as it exists right now, is able to survive for the next century? And go ahead.
No, so go ahead. No, no, you go ahead, please. I'll do. Then I'll
Uh,
answer.
the last question in that kind of like little three package is what would a future without America look like?
Mm, well, wow. The third one is the hard. I mean, they're all great questions. The third one's really hard. So I'll answer that one last, so I can think about while I'm
Okay,
answering the first two.
no
So,
problem.
first of all, are we at this moment? I think was this the first or second? We going from a
First,
republic to an
yeah.
empire, right? Um, to some extent, we've already become an empire, right? To some extent, some of that has already happened, right? If you think about the range of the American military presence around the world, if you think of the role of the dollar, in a sense, the Federal Reserve, right, acts as the bank of the world, right? Which is quite extraordinary because they were not in the Constitution, then created in 1913, and they were not supposed to be even a central bank of the U.S., but they play this role. I mean, Jerome Powell, the current chair of the Federal Reserve, you could argue is actually the most powerful person in the world, right? Because he ends up setting interest rates in the U.S., which set the interest rates everywhere else. So the cost of your borrowing to buy a house or open a business in Japan is affected by what Jerome Powell does here. I mean, it's incredible, and no one's elected him to anything, right? So some of those elements are there. Unlike the Roman experience, we have been able to meld becoming an empire with preserving, I think, more elements of our democracy than Rome did, at least so far. And whether we'll continue to do that is the question, but I think we can. And one of the reasons we can is because of Edward Gibbon, because we have that history and we've been able to learn from that history, right? Human beings do make progress. We never will reach perfection, but we make progress because we can learn from the mistakes of others. And so I'm so happy you're reading Gibbon. I want everyone to read that. I want everyone to go into that dark space. So we come out and say, no, not this is not inevitable, but this can happen, and we need to take measures to prevent this from happening. I don't think we're going to reverse our international presence in the world. But if we're doing that, we need to preserve democracy in certain ways. So, for example, we need to do what I think is happening in this election, get more young people out to vote. Rome lost its Republican status because the public basically it outsourced and agreed to outsource power to dictators. I see Gen Z saying, no effing way. We're going to go out and make a difference. My students are voting more than I've ever seen them. They're particularly my female students. And whether I agree with them or not, that's one of the inoculations. So we can learn. If we don't learn, yes, we can go that route. But I don't think we have to. I don't think we have to. Now remind me what the second question was. I know I was going to forget.
The second question was, do you think America as it exists today could exist for another century?
I think absolutely not. No society stays static. As we've talked about, America as it exists today is not the America of the 19th century. And if we try to preserve, here I'll say something political, if we try to make America great again, and preserve this kind of mythic society of the 1950s or whatever it is people like that think about, that's the surest way not to exist, right? It's like trying to say, okay, IBM was a great company. I want to bring us back to that. It's a joke. I mean, no one in the business world would take that seriously, right? Google won't look the same, or Meta, whatever. None of them will look the same in 10, 20 years. If they're successful, they're going to look different. The American experiment from our founders was an experiment that should keep reinventing itself. What did Jefferson say? He said every 20 or 30 years we need to have another revolution. He didn't mean a full revolution. We need to rethink who we are. We are overdue for that. We did this with the Civil War. We created three, as I talked about in my recent book, three new amendments that totally changed things. Ended slavery, created voting rights that didn't exist before, equal protection under the law. We did this in the early 20th century with a whole new series of amendments, income tax, women's suffrage, for example, right? We're overdue for it again today, right? So we shouldn't look the same. The question is, what America will there be in a century? Will it be a society that continues to innovate? I say yes, not because of our politicians. No, I say yes because of the people, because I see in my classroom, and I travel a lot around the world. We have, I don't know if we have the most innovative people. We have some of the most innovative people in our society. And there's no reason we can't innovate politically within a democratic frame, just as we innovate in business within a capitalist frame. So I hope we won't look the same. I hope we'll be a different kind of democracy. I hope it'll be a democracy in 100 years that no one could imagine today, but it's still very democratic. And so that takes us to the last place. What would the world be without the United States? I don't know. I mean, I think the United States is less necessary to the world than it thinks it is. It's very narcissistic to say we're the essential nation, and this is nonsense. Actually, no one is essential. No one is. You learn this, when you're a parent. Like, your kids need you, but they don't. Once they go off to college, like where mine are now, they just need you to write checks. They don't really need you beyond that, right? Now it's not even checks; it's Venmo, right? They need my Venmo.
Just direct deposit.
Yeah, and I'm probably behind on that. I'm sure you're using something else. Like you just like look, and it goes through your eyeballs, right?
Exactly.
So the world doesn't need the United States, but I do think right now, at least, if the United States were to turn inward completely, it would allow some very powerful non-democratic actors to do a lot of bad things. I think of Russia and China. And this, I don't mean to say these are countries that are all bad. They're not. Of course, they have wonderful people in them, but they have leaderships that I think are doing things that would deny the democratic experience and deny innovation to many other societies. And so I do think the United States does play an important role, not as the savior of democracy, that's overstated, but as one of a number of big actors, and the biggest of those actors in supporting, for example, people in Ukraine who are fighting just to keep their homes. Right. I think that's a very important role. And we're not doing that because we're altruistic. We see it as in our interest. And I think it is in our interest.
Not to push back, Dr. Suri.
Oh,
First of all,
please.
thank you for entertaining all of those questions, and thank you for answering them in an optimistic and detailed manner. But if I may push back
Please.
just a little bit, um, are we not kind of treating America right now as this last bastion of hope and military dominance against the foes of Russia and China and other countries? But that's one question. Another question is that, let's say America kind of tumbles down the totem pole or the pecking order. Is there space for other countries to not assume an America, like the position of America that exists right now, but to assume some kind of like dominant and mightiful stance that emulates some of the things of America, but instead of having one kind of strange attractor that is called the United States, we have different kinds of countries around the world.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first one, you're right. It's Lincoln actually who says we're the last best hope on earth,
Mm.
and we kind of it's like an article of faith among Americans, right? If you run for office, you have to say that. You don't know what it means, but you have to say it, right? And it's narcissistic. And you're right. We're not the last great bastion, and sometimes we're the problem. Right. If you talk to my friends from Chile or Brazil, I was in Brazil recently, and the Brazilians say, yeah, the Chinese are a problem, but you're the ones who launched a coup against us in 64 and overturned our democracy, right? So sometimes we're not the last bastion of hope. We're the source of the problem. And we need to recognize that in ourselves, right? Self-awareness, as you said earlier so well, right? We need more of that, which is why we study our history. Most Americans, I tell my students, there was a coup in Brazil in 64 we were responsible for. They don't even know. It's not that they, are biased. They're ignorant, and it's not their fault. No one's taught them that, right? So we shouldn't overstate our role. That said, we shouldn't understate our role either. We are a very big country, and we do, for all the mistakes we've made, we do actually also have a long tradition of supporting and promoting democracy. It's both of those things, right? And so we're not the saviors of the world, but we're an important actor. And part of what I think we all need to learn, it's a lesson Gen Z, I think, is learning, is that we have certain responsibilities. So I don't see this as, making ourselves knights in shining armor and saying we have a right to come in and tell you what to do. No, no, no. But we have responsibilities. We have responsibilities to a world order that we help to build that we benefit disproportionately from. And so I would think of it in that way. If we're part of the community, we don't get to tell the community what to do, but we're one of the biggest, richest, strongest actors. So we have some obligations when there's a threat to the community. And then, to your next question about falling in the pecking order in other societies, I think over time, other societies will legitimately take on certain roles that we've assumed for ourselves, roles we probably shouldn't have had before. And we might be moving to a world, you used the term unipolar before, a world now that is more regional, not just multipolar, but more regional, where you see a lot of Chinese power in Asia and a lot of, I don't know, Russian power in Central Asia, the United States in the Western Hemisphere, more regional world, which would actually be more normal historically, right? Where there are limits to how powers can operate beyond that space, and that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I do think the United States does have certain capabilities that most other countries don't have, and I'd like us to see us not use those capabilities flagrantly, but to use them in a restrained, thoughtful way to encourage some of the best elements across regions that are possible. So I'll give you one example. I do think we did a little bit of this, but I'd like to see us doing more as a country working on global health issues. We have enormous capabilities to produce vaccines, as we showed. We're not the only ones. India had its own vaccine. China had its own. But you know what? Ours were a lot better, and we could make them a lot faster. And I'm not saying we should give that away for free, but I'd like to see us use that capability to inoculate more of the world, because that will certainly benefit us. I'm not even trying to be altruistic about it. I'm just, if we had, in my dream, the World Health Organization would actually have the ability to quickly move in to areas where a new pandemic starts and quickly inoculate people who are willing to be inoculated, share information with them, and save us all a lot of trouble. And maybe China could be part of the story, but it would be too much to ask Italy to take the lead on that, right? There is a role for larger powers.
Yeah, thank you for saying it in that way, because a lot of people get very frightened when they think about America not being number one or not being kind of like this grandfathered in country. It's like obviously America has to be first, and then you sometimes have to like walk it back and say, even if America isn't first, even if America is sharing first place, it doesn't necessarily spell the end of humanity or the end of America. You can still exist in a fluid manner. Speaking of, you used the word flagrant. I think you would be great on the Flagrant podcast as well with Andrew Schultz. That would be a great episode. Just saying that. I have two more questions for you. So Lex, he asked you what advice you have for young people, and you said you answered very eloquently, and you said network. You don't know anybody who hasn't had an incredible network and who hasn't ever leveraged that network in order to gain
Right.
an incredible opportunity. Does that advice still exist today in that way?
Yes.
And if so, like, could you provide examples of how to leverage a network? How do you build that as a young person? How do you leverage it?
Sure. Terrific. It's actually advice I'm often giving my students, and they're helping me to get better at giving this advice because they come back and push back on it. And it's, as with everything, it's a dialogue, right? The way you get things done is by finding people who are creative, interesting, and have resources, who can help shape what you're doing to make it better for more people. And that means connecting to more people, and not people who are just the same as you. And so, what does this mean in practice for a young person? I think it really means traveling outside of your comfort zone, making sure, and I mean literally traveling and mentally traveling outside of your comfort zone, listening to podcasts outside of your space, going to events, participating in discussions, virtual and in person, showing up, and making a difference. Too many people see the internship they want, because you can't imagine how many letters of recommendation I write for internships for students, right? The internship they want is the step to the job they want. I want the internship at Accenture, so they'll hire me at Accenture as a consultant. I want the internship at this startup because I want to get into that community. Well, if you're so committed to that, you're probably already part of that network. Get yourself out of that network. Do something in the summer. I understand people need to earn money in the summer, but find a way to earn money in the summer doing something completely different. Put yourself in those places where it's low risk and possible high reward, and be self-conscious about that when you're choosing what clubs to belong to, when you're choosing where to put your time. And your most valuable asset as a young person is not your money or your brain. Quite frankly, it's your time and your body. And put your time and your body into the things that you think will broaden your space. You don't have to be around people who are going to remunerate you, and you don't have to be around people who agree with you. In fact, you're better off if you're around people who are doing other interesting things. Your criteria should be, is it something interesting I need to know more about that I don't know enough about, or there might be some interesting people for me? And then good things will happen. What I fear, Ayush, is that we get too stratified too early and too professionalized. And so our lines, we know a lot of people. The average person has a larger network than they ever did in history. And the more educated you are, the more your network grows. But it tends to be a network of people just like you. And so you don't have that advantage. Why is this so important? Because the opportunities and challenges you will face as our world changes so quickly are unpredictable. And the more narrow your view, just the law of large numbers tells us the less you'll know people who will be helpful for the things outside that space. And if you know people outside that space and you can get ahead of the curve, I mean, that's the secret to success, right? Wow, I see this thing happening and I know some weird person over there who can tell me more about it, and maybe I can connect with this person. Maybe it becomes a side hustle of mine, and look at what that becomes, right? I mean, we all know so many super successful people who, for what they did for their major success, it was a side hustle that
Right.
grew into something else, right?
Right, like Steve Jobs went to I mean, I think he dropped out, but then he started taking random classes. He just went into a typography class,
That's
and
right.
he that ended up being, one of the major differentiators between Apple's OS
Totally.
and Microsoft's. So again, a lot of I think Niall Ferguson, again on the Lex Friedman podcast, said we need to have more kind of not cross-generational, but we need more cross-generational people, more cross-generational groups. But he wants people to have knowledge of how autonomous vehicles work, then also have very intricate knowledge of Shakespeare.
Yeah,
Having that
absolutely.
mesh, having that
Absolutely.
intersection.
A broader set, and that, take interesting classes. I'm skeptical of anyone who gets all A's in one discipline. You're not challenging yourself enough. Take yourself out of your comfort zone. Another example of this, a non-tech example, is J.K. Rowling, right? The author of Harry Potter. She wrote those stories for her kids. It was her nighttime hustle, right? She wrote those stories for her kids because she wasn't satisfied with the stratified, predictable things that kids are given. And so she said, every parent does this. I don't like the food that's being offered, so I'm going to make my own food for my kids. She started writing her own stories for her kids. And we all know where that led, right? I see that in all of my Gen Z students. They've got so much energy and so much knowledge, but I sometimes feel like their parents and others are telling them to underperform. Just find. So many of them say, "My parents are engineers. They told me to be an engineer because they know I'll make a good salary that way." Yeah, that's true. But are you going to be happy? Is that really what you want to do? And what kind of engineer do you want to be?
Yeah, that advice, and I've also heard this advice and I've been given this advice, only works for a unipolar world.
Exactly.
It doesn't work anymore. You
That's right.
you have to be multifaceted, multidisciplined. You have to have interests in multiple areas, and that's okay. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be super strategic of which interests. Like you don't want to do engineering and then quantum engineering and see like you want a nice mix, a nice bag of skills, a nice bag of interests. It might be apocryphal, but I think Benjamin Franklin said some people die at 25 but don't get buried until 75.
He did say that. Yeah.
You don't want that.
No.
You don't want to live a stratified life and be just the cog in the machine, the person on the assembly line, going back to Ford, and just exist in a non-humane, strange way.
Yeah.
That's not a
I,
fulfilled
I
life.
think of it as a kind of venture capital for your life, but one where there's very low risk reality. Because what you're doing is early on, you're finding your passions, 4 or 5 things you really care about and love, and hopefully they're wide, they're different, and you're investing in each of them and seeing where it lands, where it takes you, right? And the worst that happens is if none of them work, those are all good things you've done. They've given you skills that you can take for something else.
Right.
But maybe one of them lands, right? Maybe you're writing stories on the side. I take it you're a writer too, Ayush, right? And all of a sudden, you've got Harry Potter, right? And maybe not. But you know what? That writing has made you better at other things. And so invest in yourself and take these calculated risks early on. Don't sell yourself short early in your life.
Absolutely. Dr. Suri, just one more question. I've enjoyed
Yeah,
this conversation so much with you.
me
And
too.
I'm testing out this last question because I have a problem with, I guess, a lot of people nowadays who don't want to ask big questions anymore. They're kind of content with the way the world is, or even if they're not content, they don't want to ask the questions to try to shift the needle. And so I want to ask folks like yourself, if you had a magic wand and you could change one major problem in the world, what would it be and why?
I would, if I had a magic wand, I would offer every young person the highest quality education with the access to the most resources, the most passionate, informed teachers. I'm not even talking college, I'm talking, K through 12. I would offer them the gold plated education without all of the other stuff that comes along with it, the elitism, everything, but the ability to learn calculus and read Shakespeare and be around some of the best teachers for that, because I think there's nothing more important. And it breaks my heart that so many talented people, because of the luck or misfortune of birth, are in a situation where they never get access to that kind of education, and it changes their lives. It's very hard to transcend that if you haven't been educated.
This is an incredible conversation, Professor Suri. Where can we find you online? What is your podcast called? Please list all your books as well.
Sure. So my podcast is called This is Democracy. And again, it's my podcast and my son. He's on there with me too. I need to give him credit. He's our
Absolutely.
podcast poet as well. My Substack is Democracy of Hope. And my recent books, Civil War by Other Means, The Impossible Presidency, Henry Kissinger and the American Century, Power and Protest, and Liberty's Surest Guardian. Those are the most recent books I've written.
Dr. Suri, thank you so much.
My pleasure. I've really enjoyed this conversation.